The final candidate moved into the sun-drenched circle of the training yard, and the ambient murmur of the royal court died on the wind. She was Dhampir, that much was clear from the burnished bronze of her skin and the unsettling stillness she possessed, a predatory calm that set her apart from the full-blooded vampires whose movements were liquid grace, and the humans whose every breath was a frantic, fleeting percussion. Her name was Sage. It was the only thing Prince Adrian knew about her, and it felt insufficient, a single smooth stone meant to represent a mountain. She held two short swords, their steel pale and hungry in the high morning light. Her opponent, a hulking vampire guardsman named Castor, whose reputation was built on shattered bones and snapped pride, circled her with a predator's confidence. He sneered, a flash of elongated canines. "Half-blood. You think you have the stamina to protect a prince of the night?" Sage did not answer. Her gaze, the color of ancient moss, remained fixed on him, missing nothing. It was this that Adrian found himself watching from the shaded colonnade of the palace. Not the fight itself, but her eyes. They were the eyes of a creature that had seen too much and felt too little, or perhaps had forced itself to feel nothing at all. For 6 days now, he had watched these trials, a procession of posturing warriors and brutish mercenaries, each promising unwavering loyalty in exchange for the prestige of serving as the heir's personal shadow. They were all the same, arrogant, loud, their skill a clumsy shout. Sage was different. Her skill was a silence that consumed all other sound. The fight began not with a clash, but with an evasion. Castor lunged, a blur of speed meant to overwhelm. Sage was simply not there. She moved with an economy that was breathtaking, her feet barely seeming to disturb the dust. No wasted motion, no flourish. Every pivot, every dip of her shoulder was a precise calculation of survival. She did not fight like a vampire, relying on supernatural speed, nor like a human, relying on brute force. She fought like a Dhampir, a perfect, deadly synthesis of both. She used Castor's own momentum against him, letting his ferocious charges carry him past her, leaving his flank exposed for a fleeting, perfect moment. The flat of her blade struck his sword arm with a crack that echoed across the yard. He roared, more in frustration than pain. The court vampires, assembled to watch the spectacle, shifted with unease. They were used to dominance, to the effortless superiority of their bloodline. To see one of their own so thoroughly outmaneuvered by a half-breed was an offense to the natural order. Adrian felt a grim satisfaction. The natural order had felt like a cage his entire life. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the cool marble of the balustrade. His father, the king, stood beside him, his expression unreadable, a mask of regal indifference that had been perfected over centuries. But Adrian saw the slight tightening of his jaw. He saw the flicker of something. Was it grudging respect or deepening disdain? In his ancient eyes. The fight ended as quietly as it had begun. Castor, enraged and sloppy, overextended in a final desperate lunge. Sage sidestepped, a whisper of movement, and the tip of her sword came to rest in the tiny, vulnerable space just below his jaw. Her other blade was pressed flat against the back of his neck. Checkmate. The yard was utterly still. Not a single breath seemed to be drawn. Sage's expression had not changed. There was no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only the calm, unwavering focus of a tool that had completed its task. "Yield," she said. Her voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it carried across the yard with absolute authority. Castor, trembling with humiliation, let his greatsword fall. It clanged against the stones, a sound of finality. "It is decided," the king's voice boomed, startling the silence. "The Dhampir will serve." He turned and swept back into the palace without another word, the dismissal as absolute as a death sentence. The courtiers began to murmur again, their whispers sharp and cruel as broken glass. Adrian pushed himself away from the balustrade and descended the stairs, his own guards trailing behind him. He walked into the center of the yard, stopping a few feet from her. The sun was hot on his pale skin. Up close, he could see the fine scars that traced the line of her jaw, the exhaustion deep in her eyes that her posture did not betray. "You have my gratitude and my service," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He offered a slight, formal bow, a gesture of respect he had offered to none of the other candidates. Sage pulled her blades back and sheathed them in a single, fluid motion. She did not return the bow. Instead, she dropped to one knee, her head bowed, her fist pressed to her heart in the traditional salute of the royal guard. "Your Highness, my life is yours to command." The words were a vow, a chain she was forging and fastening to him. But Adrian heard the distance in them, the cold, hard wall of professionalism she was erecting between them. He was not a person to her. He was a charge, a duty, an object to be protected. He looked at the bowed head of this fierce, solitary woman and felt the familiar ache of his own isolation deepen into something sharper, something more profound. He was the most powerful heir in the kingdom, and he had never felt more alone. The first week was a study in silence. Sage was a ghost in his periphery, a shadow that clung to the edges of his gilded life. She stood sentinel outside his chambers, her posture an unyielding line of granite. She walked 3 paces behind him in the echoing marble corridors, her footsteps so light they were more a feeling than a sound. She was present in every moment, yet entirely absent. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, her moss-green eyes revealing nothing of the woman behind them. She was a weapon, honed and waiting, and he was the thing she was meant to protect. Adrian found the suffocating weight of her presence unbearable, not because of the scrutiny, but because of the chasm of silence that separated them. The court was a place of whispers, of veiled insults and treacherous smiles. He was used to being an object of speculation, a pawn in the ancient, blood-soaked games of vampire politics. But Sage's silence was different. It wasn't political. It was absolute. A fortress of duty she had constructed around herself. And he found himself wanting, desperately, to see what lay inside. He tried to breach the walls, using the only tools he had, courtesy and genuine curiosity. One afternoon, he found her in the vast, dust-moated royal library, where he often sought refuge. She was not reading, but standing near the towering shelves of ancient lore, her gaze distant, as if she were looking through the walls of the palace to a horizon he could not see. "Is there anything here that interests you?" he asked, his voice gentle. He gestured to the shelves. "Histories of the unseen wars? Treatises on celestial magic? We even have a surprisingly robust collection of human poetry, if you can tolerate the sentimentality." She turned her head, her eyes focusing on him with an unnerving suddenness. "My interests are irrelevant to my duties, Your Highness." The title was a shield, a way of reminding him of the distance between them. "My name is Adrian," he said, a hint of frustration coloring his tone. "And your interests are not irrelevant to me. You are to be my constant companion. It would be preferable if we could converse as more than just a prince and his guard." A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed her face before it was smoothed away. "My duty is to ensure your safety, not to provide companionship, Your Highness." The finality in her voice was like a slammed door. The War Council convened in the echoing stone chamber, a place of maps and daggers and cold strategy. Adrian stood at the great table, surrounded by his father's generals, ancient vampires whose names were written in blood across centuries of conquest. General Corvus, a scarred veteran of the unseen wars, was advocating for a preemptive strike against the border settlements of the southern covens. "We strike now, while they're weak," Corvus growled, his fist coming down on the map. "Burn 3 villages. Send a message written in ash." The other generals murmured agreement, a low rumble of ancient violence. Adrian studied the map, his fingers tracing the small markings that indicated settlements. "These villages are farming communities. They have no strategic value. Burning them accomplishes nothing but the creation of martyrs and refugees who will swell our enemies' ranks with righteous fury." Corvus sneered. "Your Highness would lecture us on warfare? You, who have never held a blade in true battle." "No, Adrian replied, voice quiet but steady. But I have read every account of the Crimson Wars. I know what happened when King Thaddeus burned the river settlements 400 years ago. The survivors didn't surrender. They became the core of the resistance that cost us a decade and 10,000 soldiers. History is not a weakness, General. It is a weapon you refuse to wield. The room fell silent. His father, seated at the head of the table, regarded him with those unreadable, ancient eyes. For a moment, Adrian thought he saw a flicker of something. Respect? Curiosity? But it vanished. My son speaks of history, the king said, his voice a low rumble. But kingdoms are built on present strength, not past lessons. We will discuss Corvus's proposal further. Adrian, you are dismissed. It was a public rebuke, a reminder that his voice held no true weight. As Adrian left the chamber, Sage falling into step behind him, he heard Corvus's low laugh echo through the stone corridors. His hands clenched into fists, but he kept walking. Later, in the library, Sage found him staring at an ancient battle map, his jaw tight with frustration. You were right, she said quietly from the doorway. About the villages. About the history. He looked up, surprised. She so rarely offered unsolicited words. My father didn't think so. Your father, she said carefully, stepping into the room, rules through fear. It has worked for a millennium. But fear is a tide that eventually turns. She moved closer, her gaze on the map. A king who understands why empires fall is a king who can prevent his own from falling. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. Their eyes met, and for the first time, he saw not just duty in her gaze, but respect. Real respect. For him. Not for his title, but for his mind. Why did you take the oath? He asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The one that binds you to this life, to this. He gestured between them, to the impossible gulf of their stations. The shadows reclaimed her face as she looked away again. Oaths are sworn for two reasons, Prince Adrian. For what we wish to gain, or for what we are terrified to lose again. She moved back toward the door, the brief, fragile moment of connection ending. You should return to your duties. The council will expect your presence at dinner. For the first time since she had entered his service, Adrian felt as though he had glimpsed the woman beneath the armor. And the glimpse only made him want to know more. The first attempt on his life was pathetically subtle, a coward's gambit disguised as an accident. It happened during the vernal equinox gala, a night when the palace was swollen with guests and the air thick with perfume, ambition, and the metallic tang of blood-laced wine. Adrian despised these events. He was an ornament, a symbol of continuity, expected to drift through the crowds making pleasant, meaningless conversation, while his father conducted the real business of the kingdom in shadowed alcoves. Sage was a specter at his back, her dark leather armor a stark contrast to the silks and velvets of the court. Her presence was a low hum of anxiety beneath the festive music. Many of the guests, particularly the ancient, pure-blooded nobles, shot her looks of undisguised contempt. A Dhampir guarding the air was an insult, a stain on the court's pristine vampiric lineage. Sage seemed not to notice, her gaze constantly sweeping the room, cataloging threats, assessing angles, her focus absolute. A servant, his face slick with sweat, approached with a silver tray bearing 2 crystal goblets of the finest vintage. For you, Your Highness. A gift from Lord Valerius. Adrian reached for a goblet, but Sage's hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around his wrist. Her touch was firm, cool, and sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the potential danger. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact. No, Your Highness, she said. her voice a low command. Her eyes were not on him, but on the wine. It was a deep, luscious crimson, and a single, tiny bubble was rising to the surface with an unnatural slowness. "What is it?" Adrian asked, his own gaze following hers. "Wolfsbane," she murmured, so quietly he barely heard her. "Refined, odorless. A single drop is fatal to our kind." Before Adrian could react, she took the goblet from the tray. Her movements were a fluid, controlled grace. She looked at the terrified servant, whose eyes were wide with panic. "Who sent you?" The man began to stammer, to protest his innocence. But Sage's gaze was relentless. It stripped him bare. He broke, his eyes darting toward a portly, ostentatiously dressed vampire, standing near a marble column across the room. Lord Valerius. He was smiling, a predator's baring of teeth. But the smile froze when he saw Sage looking directly at him. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Valerius turned to flee. Sage, without a word, flung the contents of the goblet onto a nearby brazier. The flames erupted with a sickly green-white flash, and a hiss like a nest of serpents filled the air, the acrid smoke causing several nearby nobles to choke and recoil. The music screeched to a halt. In the ensuing chaos, Sage was already moving. She did not run, she flowed through the crowd, a river of purpose parting a sea of startled courtiers. Adrian watched, rooted to the spot, as she intercepted Valerius near the grand entrance. She did not draw her swords. She simply grabbed the front of his silk tunic, her knuckles white, and slammed him against the wall with a force that cracked the marble. The sound was like a thunderclap in the now silent ballroom. "An attempt on the life of the prince is an act of treason," she stated, her voice ringing with cold, lethal authority. "The penalty is immediate." Valerius, his face a mask of terror, began to blubber. But Sage was not listening. She was a force of pure, righteous duty. The king's personal guard, the Crimson Legion, began to converge, their armor rattling. But they stopped short, seemingly unsure how to intervene. This was the Dhampir's purview. Adrian finally found his feet, moving to her side. "Sage, that's enough." She did not look at him, her eyes still boring into Valerius. "He tried to kill you." "And you stopped him," Adrian said, his voice firm but calm. He placed a hand on her arm, over the worn leather of her vambrace. "He will be dealt with by the king's justice. Let the Legion take him." For a long, tense moment, he thought she would refuse. He could feel the rigid tension in her arm, the coiled power thrumming through her. It was the fury of a protector whose charge had been threatened, and it was terrifying and magnificent. Then, slowly, as if releasing a great weight, she let go. Valerius slumped to the floor, a boneless heap of silk and fear. The Crimson Legion guards moved in, hauling him away to the dungeons beneath the palace. The ballroom was a vortex of whispers and stares, all directed at them. Sage finally turned to face Adrian. In the flickering torchlight, he saw not the impassive guard, but something else. A flicker of raw, untamed emotion in her eyes. It looked like fury, but beneath it, there was a tremor of something else. Fear. Not for herself, but for him. "Are you unharmed, Your Highness?" she asked, her voice returning to its formal, clipped tone, the mask snapping back into place. "I am, thanks to you," he said softly. He did not remove his hand from her arm. He wanted to keep it there, to feel the solid, living reality of her. "You saved my life." She finally looked at his hand, then back to his face. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and gently pulled her arm away. The loss of contact was a sudden cold. "It is my duty," she said, and turned her back to him, resuming her position, her gaze once more sweeping the room as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The wall between them was still there, but tonight he had felt the first real tremor in its foundation. He had seen the fire behind the ice. Sleep became a stranger to Adrian in the nights that followed. The memory of the green-white flame, the hiss of the burning poison, played itself over in his mind. It wasn't fear that kept him awake, but a disquieting sense of his own fragility. He was the heir, a creature of immense power and privilege, yet his life could be snuffed out by a single, odorless drop in a glass of wine. The realization was humbling, and it made the gilded walls of his chambers feel less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully appointed tomb. One night, unable to bear the oppressive silence any longer, he rose from his bed and walked out onto the private balcony adjoining his rooms. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky of black velvet, and a cool breeze whispered through the stone archways. He had expected to be alone, but she was there. Sage was sitting on the low stone parapet, a whetstone in one hand and one of her short swords in the other. She was drawing the stone along the edge of the blade with a steady, rhythmic scrape that was the only sound in the night. She was not in her full armor, but in a simple, dark tunic and trousers that allowed for ease of movement. The moonlight caught the silver of the blade and the focused, intent line of her jaw. She looked less like a guard and more like a priestess tending to a sacred rite. She looked up as he approached, her hand stilling on the blade. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "You should be resting, Your Highness." "Sleep has little interest in my company tonight," he confessed, leaning against the railing beside her. He watched her hands, the careful, precise way she held the weapon. "Does the steel ever feel like a part of you? An extension of your own arm?" She considered the question for a moment, her gaze returning to the blade in her lap. "No," she said, her voice softer than usual in the quiet of the night. "It feels like a tool, a necessary weight. To think of it as a part of myself would be to forget that I am more than the violence I must be prepared to commit." The honesty of her answer surprised him. It was the most she had ever revealed of her inner world. "And what are you, when you are not this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely to the sword, to the palace, to the duty that defined her. "What are you, Sage?" She set the whetstone and sword aside, the metal making a soft clink on the stone. She looked out over the sleeping city, a sprawling tapestry of shadow and flickering torchlight. "I was a daughter once," she said, the words barely audible. "I was a sister." The past tense hung in the air between them, heavy and cold as a shroud. Adrian didn't press. He understood loss. His own mother had faded centuries ago, a victim of the slow, creeping apathy that could claim even their long-lived kind. He knew the shape of that particular emptiness. They stood in silence for a long time, a comfortable quiet that was a world away from the strained silence of their days. It was a silence built not on duty and distance, but on a shared, unspoken understanding of grief. The air between them felt different, thinner. The space that had once seemed a vast, unbridgeable chasm now felt close. He was intensely aware of her proximity, of the warmth radiating from her body in the cool night air. "My father believes I am weak," Adrian said suddenly, the confession spilling from him into the receptive dark. "He sees my interest in books, in history, in anything other than conquest and politics, as a failing. He thinks I am not fit to rule." Sage turned to look at him, her face partially obscured by shadow. "Strength is not always measured in conquest, Your Highness. A king who understands history is less likely to repeat its bloodiest mistakes. A king who values knowledge over power can build a legacy that lasts longer than any empire built on fear." Her words were a balm on a wound he hadn't realized was so raw. She saw not weakness, but a different kind of strength. She saw him. She stood then, picking up her sword and whetstone. The brief, fragile moment of connection was ending. "You should go inside. The night air grows cold." She bowed her head slightly, a gesture that was more habit than deference, and moved back toward her post at his door, melting back into the role of his guard. Adrian remained on the balcony long after she was gone, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. What we are terrified to lose again. He looked up at the sliver of moon and felt a profound, aching certainty. He was beginning to understand what it might feel like to be terrified of losing her. And that thought, in the cold and lonely dark, was more frightening than any assassin's poison. The second attack came without warning, a brutal, direct assault that shattered the palace's illusion of impenetrable security. It was not the subtle work of poison, but the bloody, overt statement of blades in the dark. They came after midnight, specters in black cloaks, moving through the secret passages that honeycombed the ancient castle walls. They were vampires, lean and fast, their eyes burning with a fanatic's zeal. Adrian was in his study, poring over old maps of the kingdom, when the first sound reached him. A faint, wet, tearing noise from the corridor, followed by the soft thud of a body hitting the floor. The 2 Crimson Legion guards stationed at the far end of the hall were dead before they could even raise an alarm. Sage, who had been standing in her customary place near the doorway, was instantly transformed. The quiet, watchful guardian vanished, replaced by a creature of pure, lethal instinct. "Get back," she hissed, pushing Adrian behind her with one arm as she drew her twin swords. The whisper of steel leaving leather was the only sound in the room. The doors to the study burst inward, splintering off their ancient hinges. 3 figures filled the doorway, their faces obscured by cowls, their swords glinting in the candlelight. "The false heir will pay for his father's sins," one of them snarled, his voice a low rasp. What happened next was a blur of motion so fast Adrian's mind could barely process it. Sage did not wait for them to advance. She met them in the doorway, a whirlwind of controlled fury. It wasn't a fight, it was a dissection. Her blades were everywhere at once, a silver web of death. She parried a thrust aimed at her heart, the screech of steel on steel setting Adrian's teeth on edge, and in the same motion, her other blade slid under the attacker's guard and into his throat. He fell without a sound. She moved between the remaining 2, a ghost in the narrow space. The assassins were fast, supernaturally so, but she was faster. She seemed to anticipate their every move, her body a fluid dance of evasion and attack. She used the confines of the doorway to her advantage, forcing them to come at her one at a time. It was a masterful display of tactical genius, executed with breathtaking brutality. Adrian, unarmed and useless, could only watch, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the world narrow down to this one small space, to the woman who was fighting and dying for him. A 4th assassin appeared, emerging from behind the tapestry on the far wall, the hidden passage Adrian had read about in the castle's ancient architectural surveys. The assassin raised a heavy, curved dagger, preparing to strike Sage from behind. "Sage, behind you!" Adrian yelled, already moving. He grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from his desk and hurled it at the tapestry. The assassin stumbled, the fabric tangling around his blade arm for just a second. It was enough. Sage spun, dispatching the assassin with brutal efficiency. She shot Adrian a sharp look, breathing hard. "You knew about that passage." "I know about all of them," he said, his heart hammering. "I've read every blueprint, every builder's log. This palace has 17 hidden passages. I've memorized them all." For the first time, he saw something like admiration flicker in her eyes. She dispatched the second assassin with a clean thrust to the chest, but the third one's sword caught her along the ribs, a glancing but deep blow. She grunted in pain, a sharp exhalation of breath, but didn't falter. As the 4th attacker lunged from the tangled tapestry, she spun into the blow, letting the dagger sink into the thick leather of her shoulder guard, while her own sword came up in a devastating arc that nearly severed the man's head from his shoulders. She stood for a moment amidst the carnage, breathing heavily. Blood dripped from her swords onto the priceless Isfahan rug. A dark stain was spreading across the side of her tunic, and the dagger was still embedded in her shoulder. She turned to look at him, her eyes blazing with adrenaline and pain. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice strained. "No, you are," he said, rushing to her side. He reached for the dagger hilt, but she flinched away. "It's nothing. We have to move. There could be more." She pulled the dagger out herself with a sharp cry of pain that she quickly stifled. Blood welled up, dark and thick. She swayed on her feet, and for the first time, Adrian saw not an invincible warrior, but a wounded woman, pale and struggling to stay upright. He grabbed her arm, supporting her. "No, you're done. You need a healer." "There's no time," she insisted, her words slurring slightly. "My duty is to get you to the secure chambers." "Your duty is done for tonight," he said, his voice hard with an authority he didn't know he possessed. The sound of running footsteps and shouting echoed from the corridor, the rest of the palace guard finally arriving. "You did your job. You saved me. Now let me save you." He half-carried, half-dragged her away from the doorway and toward the relative safety of his bedchamber. She fought him feebly, muttering about protocol, about duty, but her strength was fading. He laid her down on the edge of his bed, the fine silk of the coverlet immediately soaking up the blood from her side. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow. He looked at her, so fierce and strong, now laid low in his defense, and a wave of cold, terrifying rage washed over him. Rage at those who had done this, and a deeper, more profound terror at the thought of what he would have lost if she had fallen. The royal physicians swept into the room, two ancient, hawk-faced vampires whose hands were as skilled with a scalpel as they were with a wine-glass. They clucked their tongues at the sight of Sage, bleeding on the prince's bed, their disdain for her half-blood status warring with their professional obligations. "Clear the room," the elder physician, a vampire named Alaric, commanded the assembled guards. "We need space to work. Your Highness, if you would." He gestured for Adrian to leave. "I'm not going anywhere," Adrian stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. He knelt by the bed, taking a clean cloth from a nearby basin of water and pressing it gently against the gash in Sage's side. She flinched, her eyes fluttering open. They were clouded with pain. "Your Highness, protocol," she whispered, her voice a thread. "Damn the protocol," he said softly, his gaze locked on hers. "Stay with me, Sage." Alaric sighed, a sound of immense patrician weariness. "As you wish, Your Highness, but this will not be pleasant. Dhampir physiology is unique. Our standard coagulants will be less effective." He and his assistant began to work, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of her tunic. Adrian did not look away. He watched them clean the wounds, the deep slash along her ribs and the vicious puncture in her shoulder. He saw the intricate tracery of old scars that mapped her skin, a history of violence written on her body. Each one was a testament to a life spent in peril, a life dedicated to protecting others. He felt a surge of protective tenderness so fierce it stole his breath. This woman had spent her entire existence as a shield, and for whom? For people like Alaric, who looked at her with contempt even as they saved her life? For a court that saw her as a useful but distasteful tool? When the physicians began to stitch the wounds, Sage's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. A low sound of pain escaped her lips, a sound she tried desperately to suppress. Without thinking, Adrian reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She squeezed his hand, her nails digging into his palm, channeling her agony into that single point of contact. He welcomed it. He held on, murmuring quiet, soothing words, telling her she was safe, that he was there. The physicians finished their work, bandaging the wounds with clean white linen. They administered a draft for the pain and to ward off infection. "She will need rest," Alaric said, already packing his instruments. "She has lost a significant amount of blood. Even with her resilient nature, recovery will take time." He bowed stiffly and departed, his assistant trailing in his wake. The room fell silent, save for the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of Sage's breathing, which was already evening out as the potion took hold. Adrian did not let go of her hand. He sat on the floor by the bed, watching her face in the flickering light. The pain had eased from her features, leaving her looking younger, more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. Her mask of stoic duty had been washed away by pain and exhaustion, and the woman beneath was achingly real. He stayed there for hours, long after the castle had been secured and the bodies of the assassins removed. He listened to her breathe. He felt the steady, reassuring pulse in her wrist. He thought about the moment the dagger had struck her shoulder, the calculated sacrifice she had made for him. She had willingly taken a blade meant for him. She had put her body between him and death. It was not just duty. He knew that now, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. Duty did not explain the ferocity in her eyes, the sheer, unyielding will to protect that he had witnessed. Duty did not explain the way she had held his hand. He looked at their joined hands, his, pale and slender, the hand of a scholar and a prince. Hers, calloused and scarred, the hand of a warrior. They were from different worlds, a chasm of blood and station between them. But in that quiet, fire-lit room, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the warmth of her skin against his, the rise and fall of her chest, the simple, miraculous fact that she was alive. Love, he realized, was not a grand declaration or a poetic verse. It was this. This quiet, desperate need to keep another person safe. This overwhelming gratitude for their existence. It was sitting in the dark, holding the hand of a wounded warrior, and knowing, with every fiber of your being, that you would burn the world to the ground before you let anyone hurt them again. The potion the physicians had given her was strong, pulling her down into a deep, dreamless sleep. Adrian watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, a rhythm that was both fragile and profoundly reassuring. The first light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the high arched windows, painting the room in shades of gray and rose. He had not moved from his spot on the floor beside her bed, had not relinquished his hold on her hand. He knew he should let her rest, should summon her attendants and return to the charade of his princely duties. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. The events of the night had stripped away all artifice, leaving behind a raw and undeniable truth. He loved her. The thought was not a surprise. It felt more like an acknowledgement of something that had been growing in the quiet spaces between them for weeks. It had been there in the library, on the moonlit balcony, and in the chaos of the ballroom. Last night it had been forged into certainty in the crucible of violence and fear. He gently released her hand, the skin retaining his warmth for a fleeting moment, and rose to his feet. He walked to the window and looked out at the awakening city. The world outside was unchanged, but his own world had been irrevocably altered. He could no longer pretend that she was merely his guard, that their relationship was defined by protocol and duty. He could no longer honor the silence and the distance she so fiercely maintained. It was a lie, and it was a lie that had become too heavy to bear. He turned back to the bed. Her face in the soft morning light was unguarded. The harsh lines of discipline had softened, revealing a beauty he had only glimpsed before. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the slight curve of her lips. He felt an overwhelming urge to touch her, to trace the line of her cheek, but he restrained himself. He would not take advantage of her vulnerability. When she finally stirred hours later, the midday sun was streaming into the room. Her eyes fluttered open, disoriented, before focusing on him. He had moved to a chair beside the bed, a book lying open and unread in his lap. "Your Highness," she whispered, her voice rough. She tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath and a wince of pain stopped her. "Easy," he said, moving to the edge of the bed. "Don't move. You were badly injured." He poured a glass of water from a carafe on the bedside table and helped her take a few small sips. She sank back against the pillows, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on the blood-stained coverlet which a servant had replaced while she slept. Her memory of the night came rushing back. "The assassins?" "Dealt with," he said. "The palace is secure. You took down 4 of them before the guard even arrived. They're calling you the Lioness of the West Wing." A faint flush colored her cheeks. "It is my duty." He shook his head slowly. "No. That was more than duty, Sage. You know it and I know it." He took a breath, the words he had been rehearsing all morning suddenly feeling clumsy and inadequate. "I cannot pretend this is about duty any longer. Not for me. When I saw that dagger strike you, when I thought I might lose you..." His voice broke and he had to stop. Her eyes, clear and sharp despite her pain, were fixed on his face. She was utterly still, her expression unreadable, but he could see the rapid pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. "I love you, Sage," he said, the words falling into the quiet room with a weight of their own. "I think I have from the moment I saw you in the training yard. I love your strength and your silence and the fire you try so hard to hide. I love the woman you are beneath the armor and the oaths." He had expected denial, or anger, or a cold recitation of her duties. He had not expected the raw, naked terror that flooded her eyes. She looked at him as if he had just dealt her a mortal wound. She shrank back against the pillows, her hand instinctively going to her bandaged side. "You must not say that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are the prince. I am your guard. There is nothing else. There can be nothing else." "Why?" he pressed, his heart aching at her fear. "Because of my station? Because of your blood? None of that matters to me." "It has to matter," she said, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "It is all that keeps the world from falling into chaos. My oath. I swore an oath. To have no connections, no family, no love. To be a shield and nothing more. To feel what you are suggesting, it is a betrayal of everything I am. Everything I have sworn to be." "An oath sworn to a world that despises you for what you are?" he countered, his own voice rising with passion. "An oath that demands you carve out your own heart? That is not honor, Sage. That is mutilation." Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked away, her jaw tight with the effort of holding them back. "You don't understand. You cannot understand what it costs." He reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek. She flinched, but didn't pull away. Her skin was soft, and a single tear escaped, tracing a hot path over his thumb. "Then make me understand," he pleaded softly. "Don't hide from me, Sage. Not anymore." She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her. For a long, agonizing moment, she said nothing. He thought she was going to retreat again, to raise the walls of duty and silence so high he could never hope to scale them. But then she took a ragged breath and looked at him, her eyes filled with a world of pain. "The oath was sworn on my brother's grave," she said, her voice thick with unshed grief. "He was a guard, like me. He fell protecting a noble who saw him as little more than a dog. He died for duty, and I swore that my heart would never lead me to the same end. That I would be stronger, that I would be steel, that I would never love anything I could not bear to lose." She looked at him, and the full weight of her tragedy, of her choice, was in that gaze. "And I cannot bear to lose you." The confession was tangled in her denial, a truth wrapped in thorns, but it was there. He heard it. His own heart fractured and soared in the same instant. She was not pushing him away because she felt nothing. She was pushing him away because she felt everything. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and closed his eyes. "You won't lose me," he whispered. "And I will not lose you. I don't care about your oath. We will find a way." She began to weep then, not loudly, but with silent, shoulder-shaking sobs, a storm of grief and fear and a desperate, burgeoning hope she had denied herself for years. He held her, carefully, mindful of her injuries, and let her cry. He was holding the shattered pieces of her past, of her vow, of her heart. And he knew, with a fierce and unshakable resolve, that he would spend the rest of his very long life helping her put them back together. Turmoil became Sage's shadow, a constant companion more intimate than even her duty to the prince. His confession had been a key turning in a lock she had spent a decade forging shut. Now, the heavy door to her heart was groaning on its hinges, threatening to swing open and expose the vulnerable, terrified thing she had hidden inside. She felt flayed, every nerve exposed. The physical pain from her wounds was a dull, distant ache compared to the sharp, tearing agony in her soul. She pushed herself back into her duties far too soon, ignoring the protests of the physicians and Adrian's worried pleas. Routine was her only anesthetic. The familiar weight of her armor, the cold grip of her swords, the silent pacing of the palace corridors, these were the rituals that had always defined her, that had always kept the chaos at bay. But now they offered no comfort. The fortress had been breached from within. She avoided him as much as her duties would allow. She kept her eyes averted, her answers clipped and formal, desperately trying to rebuild the walls he had so effortlessly shattered. But it was useless. His presence was a physical force, a warmth she felt even with her back to him. His gaze was a constant, gentle pressure on her skin. He did not press his suit, did not repeat his declaration, for which she was grateful. Instead, he simply was. He was there, his concern a quiet, unwavering light, and it was, in its own way, more devastating than any impassioned speech. One afternoon, she found herself in the training yard, the place where it had all begun. She needed to feel the burn in her muscles, the familiar sting of sweat, the clean, uncomplicated pain of exertion. She needed to beat this feeling out of herself, to hammer her heart back into the shape of cold, hard steel. She picked up a practice sword, its blunted edges and balanced weight a familiar comfort. She began the forms, the intricate katas of her training, moving through the sequences with a precision born of endless repetition. But her body remembered what her mind was trying to forget. Her movements felt hollow. The power was there, but the focus was gone. Her mind was filled with the memory of his hand in hers, the sound of his voice saying her name, the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of being truly seen. "Your form is sloppy. Your mind is elsewhere." The voice, sharp and critical, belonged to Kale, the grizzled, one-eyed Dhampir who served as the master-at-arms for the royal guard. He was one of the few people in the palace whose respect she had earned, and the only one who had ever offered her something akin to friendship. He tossed her a weighted training blade. Again, but this time, be here. Not in the prince's chambers. She flinched as if struck. She had thought herself unreadable, her inner turmoil a secret war. Kale's casual observation proved her a fool. She reset her stance, her jaw tight. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" he said, circling her slowly. "I've seen that look before. In young guards who forget what we are. We are shields, Sage. We are not meant to have a life of our own. We exist to ensure that others may have theirs. That is the honor and the curse of our blood." "It is my life," she said through gritted teeth, moving through the forms again, putting all her frustration and anger into the motions. "Is it?" Kale's blade suddenly lashed out, and she barely parried it in time, the impact jarring her arm to the shoulder. "Or is it his? An oath is not a suggestion, girl. It's a cage. You either live inside it, or you die fighting your way out. There is no in-between." His words were cruel, but they were true. They were the very words she had been screaming at herself in the dead of night. She remembered the day she had sworn her oath. She had been 16, standing over the freshly turned earth of her brother's grave. He had died protecting a minor noble in a pointless border skirmish. The noble had sent his condolences in a sealed letter, along with a pouch of coins that felt like an insult. Her brother's life, his laughter, his dreams, had been reduced to a handful of silver and a polite, dismissive letter. She had sworn then, her hand on the cold, damp earth, that she would never be so weak. Her brother had loved. He had dreamed of a life beyond the sword, a life with a woman in a small village, a life he had been denied. His love, his hope, had made him vulnerable. She would not make the same mistake. She would be a weapon, nothing more. A weapon does not love. A weapon does not grieve. It only serves. He is not like them, she found herself saying, her voice low and fierce as she parried another of Cale's blows. He is not like the ones who use us and discard us. Isn't he? Cale pressed, his one good eye boring into her. He is a prince of the blood. He is the very pinnacle of the world that sees us as half-breeds, as tools. He may be kind, he may be gentle, but a cage made of silk is still a cage. What life do you think you can have with him? You will always be his guard, his shadow. You will watch him marry a pure-blooded princess, watch him father a true heir. And you will stand by the door, silent and invisible, with your heart breaking in your chest. Is that the life you want? His every word was a fresh cut. She cried out, a sound of pure anguish, and lunged, her training sword a blur of fury. She attacked with a wild, desperate abandon she had not shown since she was a terrified girl fighting for her life. This was not training. This was an exorcism. Cale met her assault, his expression grim, his defense flawless. He was a rock against which her storm of emotion broke. Finally, her strength gave out. Her arms trembled, her lungs burned. She dropped her sword, and it clattered to the dusty ground. She stood there, panting, defeated not by his skill, but by the crushing weight of his truth. He rested a hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm, not unkind. The path you are on leads only to pain, Sage. Let it go, before it destroys you. He walked away, leaving her alone in the center of the yard. She sank to her knees, the dust gritty beneath her palms. He was right. Every sensible part of her knew he was right. The world was not a fairy tale. Princes did not end up with Dhampir bodyguards. Love could not conquer a chasm of blood, tradition, and 1,000 years of prejudice. She had a choice. She could rip this feeling from her heart, cauterize the wound, and return to the cold, safe numbness of her duty. She could be the weapon she had sworn to be. Or she could let the door swing open. She could step through it, into a world of impossible, breathtaking risk. A world where the only certainty was the love she felt for him, and the pain that would surely follow. She looked up at the palace, at the high window of his study, where a light had just been kindled. He was there, and in that moment, the choice felt less like a decision and more like a surrender. Her heart had already betrayed her oath. It had chosen its allegiance long ago. The only question left was whether she had the courage to follow it. The night of the grand solstice ball arrived like a death sentence. The entire palace was a shimmering, treacherous jewel, every surface polished to a mirror shine, every corridor dripping with candlelight and ambition. For the court, it was the social event of the season. For Sage, it was a tactical nightmare. Adrian would be at his most visible, surrounded by hundreds of people, any one of whom could be a threat. The memory of the poisoned wine was a cold knot in her stomach. She stood by his side as he prepared in his chambers, her eyes scanning every detail, while a valet adjusted the silver embroidery on his formal tunic. Adrian was quiet, his own features drawn and tense. He caught her eye in the reflection of the long mirror. The question was there, unspoken between them. "Are you ready for this?" She gave a single, sharp nod. Her own preparations had been meticulous. She wore a fitted, dark gray tunic of reinforced leather that was elegant enough to blend in, but offered more protection than any ball gown. Her swords were at her hips, their presence a solid, reassuring weight. But her true readiness was not in her armor or her weapons. It was in the decision that had finally settled in her soul, as quiet and as absolute as a winter frost. Kale was wrong. A silk cage was not a cage if you chose to be there. Love was not a weakness if it gave you a reason to fight harder than you ever had before. She was not just his shield anymore. She was his. As they entered the grand ballroom, a wave of music and conversation washed over them. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and melted wax. Sage stayed close, her senses on high alert, her body a coiled spring. She saw the glares and whispers that followed them, the disdainful looks aimed at her. Tonight she did not care. Let them whisper. Her world had narrowed to the man beside her. Adrian moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a prince, exchanging pleasantries, accepting compliments, his face a perfect mask of regal charm. But Sage could feel the tension in him. His smiles didn't reach his eyes. She saw how he subtly angled his body to keep her in his line of sight, a small, telling gesture of trust. They were a unit, moving through the glittering sea of their enemies. The threat, when it came, was both expected and shocking in its audacity. The king was delivering his traditional solstice address from a raised dais, Adrian standing at his side. Sage was positioned at the foot of the steps, her gaze sweeping the crowd. She saw him then, a man dressed as a court musician, his face half hidden by the ornate lyre he carried. But he was no musician. His hands were wrong, calloused, scarred, the hands of a killer. And his eyes were fixed on Adrian with a terrifying, singular focus. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch into a thick, syrupy consistency. The king's voice droned on. The musician began to raise his lyre. Sage saw the glint of metal within its hollowed-out body, the crossbow mechanism. There was no time to shout a warning, no time to draw her swords. There was only time to act. She launched herself up the stairs, a blur of gray leather. She threw her body in front of Adrian's just as the musician fired. The crossbow bolt, a short, wicked-looking thing, struck her in the left side of her ribcage, embedded deep and angled upward. It would have struck Adrian directly in the heart. The impact was a brutal, fiery punch, stealing her breath and sending a galaxy of black stars bursting behind her eyes. She heard Adrian cry out her name, his voice a raw sound of anguish. She stumbled back, into him, his arms coming around her, holding her up. The ballroom erupted into chaos. The musician was trying to reload, but the Crimson Legion was already on him, a tide of red and steel. Sage looked down at the bolt protruding from her chest. Blood was already seeping between her fingers. "Punctured lung," she gasped, each word a struggle as her breath came in wet, labored rattles. "But not heart. Armor deflected." The reinforced plating beneath the leather had turned the bolt's trajectory just enough. Instead of piercing her heart dead center, it had struck lower, shattering 2 ribs and collapsing her left lung. She was drowning in her own blood, but she was alive. "Sage," Adrian was saying, his voice choked with panic. He was lowering her to the ground, his hands fluttering over the wound, unsure what to do. "No, no, no." She reached up and grabbed the front of his tunic, her grip surprisingly strong despite the blood pooling in her chest. She pulled him closer, her fingers tightening in his tunic. "Adrian," she said, her voice a raw whisper. He leaned in, his ear close to her lips. "I'm here." "My heart," she began, each word costing her a mountain of effort. "It betrayed my oath. A long time ago." She took a ragged, painful breath that bubbled wetly. "It's yours. It has always been yours." Tears were streaming down his face, falling onto her cheeks like hot rain. He understood. This was not a dying confession. It was a declaration of life, a choice made in the face of death. He bent down and kissed her, a desperate, salt-laced kiss that was not about passion, but about a promise. It was a promise to live, a promise to fight, a promise to defy a world that said they could not be. As the royal physicians swarmed around them, as her vision began to dim at the edges, the last thing she saw was his face, his eyes burning with a love so fierce it felt like it could hold back death itself. And for the first time since she was a 16-year-old girl at her brother's grave, Sage felt not the cold steel of her resolve, but the incandescent, terrifying, and beautiful warmth of hope. They stood before the throne 3 months later. The grand hall was silent, but it was a different silence than before. The entire royal court was assembled, but now there was a tension, an electric anticipation. Adrian and Sage were no longer dressed for court, but in their travel-worn clothes, his tunic dusty, her armor scored from battle. They looked like what they were, warriors who had just returned from the field. Sage stood beside Adrian, not behind him. Her left side still ached, a constant reminder of the bolt that had nearly killed her, but she stood straight, her head held high. Her moss-green eyes were fixed on the king. Behind them, General Corvus himself stepped forward, the old warhawk's face grave. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying across the hall, "the prince has secured the southern border, not through conquest, but through negotiation." The word seemed to pain him. He identified the true source of the conflict, a disputed water source that both territories needed for their farmlands. He proposed and implemented a sharing agreement backed by magical treaty bond. Lord Mordain has withdrawn his forces and sworn renewed fealty to the crown. A murmur rippled through the court. The southern border, solved, not with blood, but with the very intellectualism they had mocked. Corvus continued, and now there was something else in his voice, grudging respect. Furthermore, when Lord Mordain's nephew attempted to assassinate the prince and reignite the conflict, it was the Dhampir who uncovered the plot, who tracked the assassin through hostile territory, and who personally apprehended him. He looked directly at Sage. Her tactical instincts are without equal. The king regarded them for a long moment, his ancient eyes moving between his son and the Dhampir warrior who stood as his equal. Adrian's hand found Sage's. Her fingers were cool and steady, and she laced them through his without hesitation. The simple, public act of touch was a seismic event in the silent hall. A collective, scandalized gasp was just barely suppressed. They were not prince and guard. They were partners. "Father," Adrian began, his voice clear and steady, ringing with a newfound authority that surprised even himself. "I have not come to ask for your permission. I have come to inform you of a decision. I love this woman. I intend to bind myself to her, by blood and by vow, for all of eternity. She will be my princess, and one day she will be this kingdom's queen." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the court. A Dhampir queen. The idea was not just scandalous, it was heresy. It was a violation of the sacred purity of the royal bloodline. Lord Lucian, the brother of the executed traitor Valerius, stepped forward from the assembled nobles, his face twisted with outrage. "Your Majesty, this is an outrage, an insult to our lineage. This half-breed is not fit to stand in the prince's presence, let alone share his throne." Before Adrian could respond, Sage spoke, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a landslide. "I have bled for this kingdom, Lord Lucian. I have stood between your prince and death 3 times, while men of your family plotted treason in the shadows. My blood may not be as pure as yours, but it was pure enough to be spilled in the defense of this crown. Tell me, what has your pristine lineage offered in service, other than ambition and the poison your brother tried to use to murder the heir?" Lucian recoiled as if struck, his face contorting with rage and humiliation. A tense silence descended once more. The king remained on his throne, silent and immovable as stone. The silence stretched, a living thing that pressed down on the assembled court. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold as the grave. "You have done what I did not think possible. the king said, rising slowly from his throne. "You have shown me that strength takes many forms, that wisdom can be as sharp as any blade." He descended the steps with deliberate movements, stopping before them. He looked from his son's determined face to Sage's defiant one. And that loyalty. He looked at Sage, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time. Loyalty is not determined by the purity of one's blood, but by the quality of one's character. He placed his hand on Adrian's shoulder, then did something that shocked everyone. He inclined his head a fraction of an inch to Sage. It was not a bow, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition. "The path you have chosen will be fraught with peril," he continued, his voice resonating with the weight of ages. "The court will not accept this easily." He glanced at the assembled nobles, many of whose faces were twisted with barely suppressed outrage. "But I am not the court. I am the king. And I have seen with my own eyes what you are together." A ghost of a smile, the first Adrian had seen in a decade, touched his lips. "You have my blessing. Let those who oppose it take their grievances to me." As the king turned and ascended back to his throne, Adrian looked at Sage. Her eyes were shining, not with tears of sorrow, but with the bright, fierce light of a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. The whispers of the court, the weight of tradition, the challenges that lay ahead, all of it seemed to fade into the background. They were no longer a prince and his bodyguard, a vampire and a Dhampir. They were two souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. They had chosen each other, not in defiance of their duties, but in fulfillment of a deeper one, the duty of the heart. Their love would not be a footnote in the kingdom's history. It would be the beginning of a new chapter, one they would write together. Hand in hand, they turned to face their world, no longer separated by a chasm of prejudice, but united by a bond that had already proven stronger than steel, more powerful than poison, and more enduring than any ancient law. They were the start of something new, and they were ready.